This episode of Best Armies in 40K is brought to you by Adept Roll. More about them later in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40K, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from large events over the past week and talk about what is currently winning the metagame. And this is an exciting episode because we are starting to see some new results from some of the newly released Chaos Codexes, which we'll certainly talk about in this episode. First off, I have a little bit of a cold today, so I apologize if I'm a little sniffly or hoarse during this video. I'm on the mend, but it may come across in the recording a little bit.
Also, recording this after editing, something weird happens with my audio. I think my microphone might have drifted away from me and I didn't notice, but it gets a little funny during the video. I guess fair warning.
But anyway, let's move on and talk about a metagame breakdown. This week was a little bit of a light week in terms of GTs. Most of the events we're going to be talking about this time around are on the smaller side, between 20 and 40 players, but we did have one large event, the 5-round Munsterland Major, and that even appears on our first faction here. This week was dominated, relatively speaking, by Ultramarines, who did go undefeated at the Munsterland Major 2. They also took down the SSG Miniature Metropolis Meta Shuffle, try saying that 5 times fast, as well as Battle on the Bayou, and that is the one I'm excited to talk about this week because that event was won by an ANVIL Siege Force, a detachment that we do not typically see in competitive circles. Gonna be exciting to discuss exactly how that is going undefeated. Chaos Demons continue to do well, taking down the Munsterland Major 2 with a Shadow Legion detachment and the Hyper 352 GT with a very interesting Demonic Incursion build that we'll be discussing this week. Aeldari took down the 6-round Dawn of Var, and Necrons also went undefeated at that event, taking second place with an X-0-1 result. That is one draw on their record. However, that wasn't using differential scoring, that was a natural draw that the Necron player grabbed, which is relatively uncommon. Genestealer cults won the Ammonite Gaming May GT, Adepta Sororitas coming back into an undefeated placement after a really long time in the Down Under May Dawnbringer GT, Astra Militarum winning the Iberian Open GT Granada, Grey Knights also undefeated at the Munsterland Major 2, Tau Empire undefeated at the Midgard May GT. I know there's going to be some Tau Empire fans in the comment section excited that they were able to put up a win this week. Chaos Knights also going undefeated at the SSG Miniature Metropolis Meta Shuffle. And last but certainly not least, Death Guard, which we will be discussing this week because they were using the new and updated 10th edition Codex. I've kind of been taking Death Guard off the last 2 weeks or so because we have basically had the full Codex in hand, just it hasn't been street legal quite yet. They did win the West allotment at War RTT, although it was a GT, it was a 5-round event, using a Poxwalker Horde. Excited to talk about that one. Stay tuned while we talk about lists. Now, if you want to watch any of the coverage from this weekend, it was relatively slim pickings. Wargames Live was live with the Midgard May GT, which we will be discussing the winning list from. But other than that, I couldn't find any tournament streams live, at least for singles play on the internet. But obviously, if I have missed any, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section down below so we can get eyes on their content. And with that, let's start talking about some lists just after a word from our sponsor.
This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40K game plan will pay off? I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40K, especially if I'm identifying 2 lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll also features profile imports from both Rosterizer and New Recruit, allowing you to import your unit and attack profiles quicker and easier for faster calculations on the fly. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight, and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description.
Now we're going to start our discussion by talking about the Battle on the Bayou. This was a 29-player GT in New Iberia, Louisiana, over here in the United States. The event was won by Joseph Sanchez running Ultramarines, and unfortunately, Joseph didn't put his detachment on his army list, which is a faux pas, but maybe he was just very embarrassed by his detachment selection, which, understandable. But as we can sort of suss out, he does have the Indomitable Fury enhancement on a Gravis Captain, which does tell us that he is playing none other than ANVIL Siege Force, which is sick. Now, for those who don't know, ANVIL Siege Force is the heavy weapon-focused detachment in the Space Marine Codex. It is probably the least played and least talked about detachment, certainly in the Space Marine faction, maybe across Warhammer 40k generally. I don't know. It's not very good. It grants your ranged weapons the heavy keyword, one of the less useful keywords in the core rules, I guess to put it charitably, as well as giving your already existing heavy weapons +1 to wound, which is, I guess, a bit of a win more. If you can get your heavy weapons to also gain +1 to wound, that's pretty impressive. The list was a generally standard Ultramarines list, at least in terms of the character selections. We had Marnius Calgar, as well as Robute Gilliman, and a lieutenant with combi weapon, alongside that Gravis Captain with Indomitable Fury. That allows that guy to regenerate once per game when killed on a 2+, with all of his wounds remaining. So he's going to come back with 6 wounds and has half damage. So he's difficult to kill both times he responds, which is neat. We have a company hero squad to attach with Marnius Calgar, as well as a Desolation squad. These guys have okay synergy with the detachment ability, whereas previously granting heavy to the unit would allow them to hit, even firing indirectly
On 3s?
That actually doesn't work anymore. They still always hit on, at best, 4s when firing indirectly, so you can't improve their hit roll at all, essentially, which sucks. But they do have heavy on their rocket launchers. Today we're running Super Frag rocket launchers, which is their D6 +1 Strength 5 blast profile. It is a base weapon skill of 4+, but you can improve that to potentially 3+ to give them +1 to wound. That also sort of wombo combos with their Castellan and Vanger launchers, so the entire unit is firing 1 trillion blast attacks, which can be fairly impressive. We then also have an Infiltrator squad, 2 Scout squads for utility, 1 Invader ATV, a Ballistus Dreadnought. This guy can benefit fairly effectively from the detachment ability. It has rerolls hits already baked in, but getting it to hit on 2s as well means that it can either ignore when it's damaged or just hit on 2s, rerolling 1s, which is extremely consistent. We also have a Gladiator Reaper and a pair of Vindicators. Now, largely, this looks like most of the Gladius Task Force builds that we would see out of Ultramarines. We've basically traded the Captain and Gravis armor with Artificer armor to play him with Indomitable Fury, which does make him, slightly harder to kill, theoretically, than the Artificer armor would. Just making him harder to kill on the first blow is maybe not quite as effective as forcing you to attack him twice and potentially allowing for spillover damage to be entirely lost when targeting that Gravis Captain. So that's pretty cute. It doesn't have the same level of synergy with things like the Desolation Squad, whereas Gladius Task Force can add things like Devastator Doctrine on top of Storm of Fire to give them AP bonuses. This detachment doesn't have that. Units like the Desolators can also be extracted from engagement range using stratagems like Rigid Discipline to pull them out of combat. So there are several things that you can potentially do in order to synergize with this army. It doesn't feel to me like it synergizes quite as well as Gladius Task Force or as many of the other detachments available for Space Marines and Ultramarines in specific, especially having stratagems that could be incredibly powerful like Hail of Vengeance not affect your vehicles because they would have to be dead in order to make a reactive shot, does make it very difficult to get a ton of use out of this detachment. However, that just makes it more impressive that Joseph Sanchez was able to go 5-0 with this list. I'm so curious as to whether or not things like the heavy keyword army-wide made a huge difference to this build. I do think that there are maybe some instances in which we can find some benefits for that, but they're very few and far between, and to do so, you'd have to give up all of the other detachments that are so strong for Ultramarines, which makes this ultimate challenge mode. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Moscow to talk about the Hyper 352 GT. This was a 32-player GT, and was won by Anton Vassin, running Chaos Demons. Now, Anton was running a demonic incursion army after my own heart, because it was focused on a bunch of big stompy demons, stomping around the table and beating the crap out of people, which is a list archetype that I absolutely love. This included Be'lakor, as well as Rodigus and Skarbrand, a Grid Unclean one with the Endless Gift, we call him Ed, as well as a Rendmaster on Blood Throne. We also had some other characters tagging along with them, including Celesk as a good utility piece, a Bloodmaster to attach into a Bloodletter unit, as well as 2 individual Beasts of Nurgle for additional utility, and a Slaaneshi Soul Grinder. So altogether, we're running 4 Greater Demons, if we are including Be'lakor, Rodigus, Skarbrand, the Great Unclean one, as well as a Soul Grinder and a Chariot, plus a big brick of Bloodletters alongside a character, and 3 individual utility units. This army must have been minuscule on the table, despite the fact that most of it was enormous Greater Demons. Now, with their recent statistical improvements in their March, essentially Codex drop, big demons like this have gotten way more powerful. Skarbrand, in particular, is almost certainly one of the most powerful monster datasheets in 40k. He's certainly one of the most powerful melee combatants in the Demon faction, and especially if you could do things like grant him hit rerolls from Be'lakor, or buff up his attacks with the Rendmaster on a Blood Throne, he can potentially kill 2 enemy units at once by splitting his attacks. He's incredible, he's super fast, he does a ton of damage. The combination of the Great Unclean one as well as Rodigus, both of them having a baked-in Field of Pain, so they're not basically stapled to each other in order to gain that bonus, and instead gaining a toughness bonus for being near the Great Unclean one, makes them incredibly good at gumming up the middle of the table, sweeping infantry, and now the Great Unclean one, and now with new strength bonuses to them, can potentially punch through heavy armor as well. That's phenomenal. And we also have a counterpunch unit in the form of this Bloodmaster unit. Now, I've gone on record in saying that I don't like Bloodletters as a unit, but when you dump a ton of buffs into them, they can be very effective. Also, I will say, Bloodletters in the New World Leaders Codex, oh my god, what a difference. Army-wide Lance and the ability to rapid ingress in any phase makes. We'll certainly talk about that later on as we discuss World Eaters when they start to see some play. But in this case, the Bloodletters are going to be getting +1 to wound from the Bloodmaster, as well as potentially +1 attack from Skarbrand. You can also give them +1 AP from Draft of Terror, maybe rerolls from Be'lakor if the stars align, as well as +1 strength, AP, and damage from the Blood Throne. Now, I think generally speaking, what we're going to be doing is basically just comboing the Bloodletters with the Rendmaster on Blood Throne. That together is a relatively expensive combo, about almost 350 points, but the Rendmaster himself is fairly effective. He has a bunch of melee attacks combining the extra attacks from the Bloodletters on his throne with his own 3 damage melee profile. He gets wound rerolls against characters and monsters, so he can act as an armor cracker and buffs himself up with his own ability, so sometimes he can chip in some damage on his own. Rendmasters are phenomenal. I think they're great. The Bloodletters themselves are basically the best applicator of the Rendmaster buff. Rendmasters can point at an enemy unit at the start of the fight phase and grant your Khorne demons +1 strength, AP, and damage when targeting it. Bloodletters have +1 to charge baked in thanks to their Instrument of Chaos. They can 6-inch Deep Strike thanks to the Demonic Incursion detachment abilities, whether that's off of a Shadow of Chaos aura or just 6-inch Deep Striking normally, meaning that they're making a very reliable 5-inch charge out of Deep Strike, and then they're delivering 25 attacks if you're including both their attacks and the attached character, all of it with a baseline +1 to wound, all of it being multi-damage. So you can be attacking 20 times with 3 damage attacks, as well as 5 times with 4 damage attacks. All of those will normally be wounding your opponents on 5s. Even though it does require some setup, you can sometimes do some funky combat slingshots to get the Bloodmaster into attack specific characters and enemy units, hit them with that huge, potentially 4 damage melee swing, and beat them down by himself. In Chaos Demons as well, unlike in World Eaters, they're also OC2, so they are good, especially because they get a 6-inch Consolidate from the Bloodmaster being joined to the unit, so they're good at taking objectives as well. So, worst case scenario, Bloodletters are going to disrupt an enemy objective and maybe kill a utility unit once per game. If you can combo them out, they can potentially blow up something much more expensive, a big tank or something, and also be stealing your opponent's objectives. You have to be very careful about what they engage, because they are only T4, 5-up, invuln save infantry, so they will get knocked down by strong enemy melee units. But if you are careful with your consolidations, they can be an absolute nightmare for your opponent to deal with. What we're missing from the list, which is interesting, are staples like things like Fleshhounds and Plague Bearers to act as objective securing units. But I guess the Beasts of Nurgle are strong enough by themselves that they're able to sort of shore up the weaknesses of the list in that case. You can present a really strong front line of the Nurgle demons, use Scarbrand and the Bloodletters as counter-punching, especially alongside the Randmaster. Bellicore keeps them safe from shooting, and you can apply some shooting yourself from the Slaaneshi Soulgrinder as well. Do some utility with the Beasts of Nurgle, which are then tough to engage with themselves because you have to get through their tough defensive stat line. And altogether, you have a very creative and really interesting variety of demonic incursion. Now with that, let's move over to the largest event of the weekend, the Münsterland Major 2. This was a 119-player event held in Germany and ended up having 3 undefeated players. Because it only went 5 rounds and had 120 players in it, obviously it was going to have multiple undefeated at the end. But we want to talk about the eventual winner of the event. Obviously, both Ultramarines and Chaos Demons, who we've already talked about in this video, did go undefeated at the event. But last, but certainly not least, we have a very interesting Grey Knights list piloted by Artur Gutler. This list was a pretty standard Warpbane task force, but we are including 3 Nemesis Grandmasters, as well as 2 strike squads, more than the normal singleton strike squad that we often see, alongside no less than 3 Interceptor squads. Those are backed up by a Servitor unit, alongside 3 Nemesis Dread Knights and a Grey Knights Rhino. Now, the Rhino does get a little bit of benefit from being potentially occupied by the Strike Marines. While we do typically want to be keeping Strike Marines on the backline objective in the early game, the Rhino gaining Scout allows it to move up with that Scout and gain some secondaries in the middle of the table if it needs to. It also acts as a pretty good embarkation position for the Interceptor squads. Interceptor squads' personal teleporters allow them to move 6 inches after shooting as if it were your movement phase. There is a restriction that they can't charge after making this movement, but there is no such restriction against embarking into a transport. So what they can do is move out, potentially swap objective control over objectives to switch where your hallowed ground is positioned, then shoot, move away, and regardless of where terrain is, they can then embark into the Rhino in order to keep themselves safe so that they can do it again next turn. We've seen in previous games that these little Interceptor squads with 2+ saves and 3 2-damage melee attacks each are an absolute nightmare for the other player. They're so fast and so maneuverable that they can jet around the table and absolutely wreak havoc on their objectives. There are very few small utility units that will survive more than 1 round in combat with an Interceptor squad. While they aren't the strongest melee unit ever, they're good enough to kill something like 5 Space Marine or the majority of a 10-man guard equivalent unit in order to clear off objectives and flip control in favor of the Grey Knights player. When you are trying to deal with all of these little units, which are, generally speaking, very difficult to kill because they have things like charge debuffs from Repelling Sphere, they have a base 2+ armor save, a 1+ armor save when in cover, which means that they typically just sometimes save out of incoming damage, and you're also trying to deal with the threat of 3 Nemesis Grandmasters as well as 3 standard Nemesis Dread Knights bearing down at you. That is super difficult to do. We also have some servitors, so we can potentially even lock in our home objective and use these servitors to screen off that home objective to prevent enemies from deep striking onto it. Despite the fact that the servitors don't have an OC value, they don't need it to just hold down on the objective. Not to mention the fact that they have multi-meltas, which can also potentially benefit from the Warpbane Task Force detachment abilities. So you can use them in a couple of capacities. You can put them into the Rhino to give the Rhino the equivalent of 2 multi-meltas in a top mount using its firing deck, or you can use them to protect that home objective that you've locked in, assuming your opponent has strong deep strike and up-down mechanics of their own, redeployment mechanics, that can allow them to take that objective in the late game. While this list does have the hallmarks of the classic sort of 6 Nemesis Dread Knight build that we see so typically, the rest of the list is so incredibly finesse-oriented that I absolutely love it. These little tiny 5-man Grey Knight squads, I think, especially now that we've started to see how good they are at inflicting damage and manipulating primary objective control. Grey Knights are already an army that specializes in completing secondary objectives basically whenever they want to, and also being able to use these fast units to disrupt enemy scoring on primary objectives makes this army a nightmare to deal with. So it's no surprise that Artur was able to go undefeated with a ridiculous set of scores. This event did use differential scoring, and he came out the gate with 4 20-0 wins as well as only dropping 3 differential points in his final game with a 17-3 win. That is insane. That means all of his wins were by at least 50 points or more, which is an absolutely crazy win margin and absolutely dominating in this event metagame. Now with that, we're going to move over to Oslo, Norway, and talk about the Dawn of Var 2K25. This was a 62-player GT and ended with 2 undefeateds. They played after 6 rounds with a 5-0-1 result for Necrons, as well as a 6-0 result for Aeldari. We're going to first discuss Sveinung Newton Nording's list, who went 6-0 with a Ynnari build using Devoted of Yniad as their detachment. Sveinung was running 2 Autarchs as well as the Incarn. A little different than what we typically see. We are missing the classic inclusion of an Incubi brick with Yvrain and the Vicearch both attached, instead choosing to focus more heavily on the Aspect Warrior builds, which we do see very heavily played in Europe. These Autarchs are perfect attachments for the Howling Banshees. They add an additional set of 3 damage attacks that the Howling Banshees can use, as well as grant them rerolls on their advance rolls, which allows them to use their built-in advance and charge a little bit more effectively. As some people have pointed out as well, the Autarch with the fusion gun is actually the best place to use the Howling Banshees Aspect Shrine token. You can use that token to convert a hit, wound, or damage roll to a 6. Usually that's not particularly effective on the Howling Banshees themselves because they either have a high volume of kind of middling attacks, or you're just worried about the Executioner Blade from the Howling Banshee Exarch. The downside being that none of them have any critical effects, so any 6s don't really do that much. However, if you're able to convert a fusion gun attack, which you often do while advancing and charging because it's an assault weapon, you can roll that wound roll and then flip it to a 6 if you want to potentially do up to 9 damage on a target on your way in to charge your true target, which is pretty effective. The downside is that unlike previous incarnations of Fate dice, you can't use that on the damage roll, so you can't ensure that you get 9 damage, but you can ensure that you do successfully wound when using that token. We then have an absolutely insane number of Aspect Warriors. We are running a Warlock Skyrunner as well as a Ranger Squad for some utility, and 2 Wave Serpents in order to carry these things to the fight. In addition to that, we are running 15 Dark Reapers, 3 units of 5, 15 Fire Dragons, 3 units of 5 again, 15 Warp Spiders, 3 units of 5 of them, as well as a unit of 5 Striking Scorpions, as well as a unit of 5 Striking Scorpions. We also have a unit of Storm Guardians in order to hold down the backline objective. This allows these Ynnari armies absolute control over your capacity to score against them. They can constantly be doing things like placing warp spiders on your objectives, setting up new units to continuously contest your objectives, and ensure that you will never meet them on score. They are always going to either prevent you from scoring your secondaries or knocking you off primary objectives when using lethal intent, which they will get almost every turn because there's very rarely a situation in which you can afford not to kill any of their Aspect Warriors. They're going to be bearing down on you with tons and tons and tons of tiny units, all of which can be hyper lethal if you let them. This kind of list is an absolute nightmare to play against in the hands of a very strong player who can constantly be using the very powerful reactive effects that Ynnari have access to in order to constantly be maneuvering these units into positions to disrupt your scoring. On top of that, we also have the Incarn, who is going to similarly be maneuvering around the table, teleporting to where units are killed to retain control of objectives, or set itself up into a position to countercharge in the next turn, and constantly being a pain in your opponent's side. All of these reactive effects make this army very difficult to compete into, and the massive number of small, relatively awkward to kill units with their invulnerable save and their multi-wounds on their Exarchs mean that oftentimes it can survive just long enough to retain control of its objectives for long enough to beat you out. Now with that, we're going to move over to Rasmus Volland Fredriksen, who went undefeated with Necrons, a 4-0-1 result with a 95-point draw in the first round. That's an insane score, by the way. Now Rasmus was playing a Starshatter arsenal and a relatively standard variety. We've seen basically most of these inclusions before. This includes Imhotep the Stormlord to fuel the now more expensive Starshatter arsenal stratagems with his extra CP, the Silent King as a recipient for all of these huge buffs to make him super duper tough to kill, a Catacomb Command Barge with Dread Majesty for additional OC and reroll ones to hit and wound in a separate place from where the Silent King is hanging out, as well as a Hexmark Destroyer to hang out with the Silent King to grant him Chrono Impedance Field, so he's -1 damage. We then also have a Technomancer, which is going to be attaching into a unit of 6 Canoptic Wraiths. That can use the end of turn reanimation to keep those Wraiths alive, and that's even further buffed by the Canoptic Reanimator that's going to be inside the brick of this army. We then have 2 Cryptothralls that can attach in alongside that Technomancer to increase the size of the Wraith unit and make it truly difficult to kill, 2 units of Flayed One for some forward operation and utility, a unit of Ophidian Destroyers to up, down, and grab some secondary points, as well as 3 individual Locust Destroyers to usually come out of Strategic Reserve, but you can also use them to screen and hold down your backline, and we have some actual shooting from 2 Doomsday Arcs. The one thing that this list has traded is the Canoptic Spider that we typically see. We are getting a unit of 5 Immortals with Tesla Carbines for the cost of that Spider, and also I think increasing the number of utility units that this army has. But the inclusion of the Canoptic Wraiths, I think, is a very smart one for Starshatter Arsenal. It has a lot of very similar buffs as it does in detachments like Awakened Dynasty, and it gives you a big brick of models that are extremely difficult to kill and relatively high OC that can hold down objectives outside your deployment zone for a really long time. Other than that, the rest of the army can spread out around the entirety of the board, put Locust Destroyers and Flayed Ones everywhere in order to complete its secondaries, while holding its big units back, the Silent King and the Doomsday Arcs, that can maintain command of shooting lines down the center of the table and dare anything to move into the middle where they can concentrate all their fire onto it. Pretty standard variety of Starshatter Arsenal, but it's good to see it continuing to do well. Now we're going to move over a little bit to Great Britain, to the Ammonite Gaming May GT. This was a 26-player event and was won by Stephen Platten running Genestealer Cults. Stephen was playing a host of Ascension and included a lot of the pretty standard inclusions that we've seen in host of Ascension builds. This includes 3 Benefictus says, in order to grant lethal hits to their units alongside the sustained hits that ignore cover they're already going to be gaining from deep striking alongside their big bricks of infantry. One of them is including an Assassination Edict, giving +1 to hit targeting character units. Also a relatively inexpensive enhancement, only 15 points, which is pretty nice. We have a Biophagus with Our Time is Nigh to allow him to gain +2 to charge, once per game, as well as a Primus with Chink in their armor for lethal hits as well as his sustained hits. He also benefits his unit with rerolls, so he has a greater chance of converting those sustained plus lethal hits when arriving from reserve. You can also use Primed and Ready to grant them a 5-up critical hit as well. And then we have 2 Reductive Saboteurs for some forward operation. Following that up, we have a bunch of Acolyte Hybrids with Auto Pistols, 2 units of 5 to lock down some objectives and generate some CP. We have some skirmishing units in the form of Acolyte Hybrids with Hand Flamers. Looks like 3 total units of those. Alongside Neophyte Hybrids, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 units of 20 to attach to the Beneficti as well as the Primus to grant them their bonuses. Following that up, those guys are being buffed by Achilles Ridge Runners. There are a total of 4 Ridge Runners in the list, 2 individuals, as well as a single unit of 2. We have 2 heavy mortars and survey augers, so they're going to be able to strip cover as well as benefit that -1 AP bonus on 2 separate units. These guys will allow you to ignore cover after turns in which you arrived on the tabletop, so it allows the army to sustain its damage a little bit longer than you would typically see from a typical host of Ascension. We also then have a unit of 2 Achilles Ridge Runners, those guys equipped with heavy mining lasers and spotters for +1 ballistic skill. Theoretically, we can also benefit one of the Ridge Runners with one of the Survey Auger mortar teams so that they can get +1 AP and ignore cover as well, and actually drill into heavy targets with their mining lasers. From there, we're controlling the middle of the table with 2 units of Pure Strain Genestealers. These are some additional infiltrators that can clear out enemy screens on turn 1, so you're able to pave the way for the rest of the army to deep strike in starting on turn 2 onwards. Overall, pretty standard stuff for Host of Ascension, but it's been a little bit since we've seen this detachment do well. It's been a little bit of the Biosanctic Brood Surge show for a while, but it's cool to see these mass infantry lists, the bread and butter of the Genestealer Cults faction, continuing to take down GTs. Now with that, we're going to move over to the Down Under May Dawnbringer GT number 2. This was a 36-player GT held in Australia. Was won by Jordan McGregor playing, I think appropriately, Adepta Sororitas. For a GT called the Dawnbringer, I feel like Sororitas is probably the one that you would like to see win. Maybe Custodes on a good day, although they took second. So I think we're thematic all the way around. And Eldar took third. I think that makes sense. It's all sunshine and rainbows in this podium here. Jordan was playing a Hallowed Martyrs detachment. This is the sort of index-style detachment that gives you bonuses when you lose models out of your units. This includes a Canoness with Saintly Example, so she can generate miracle dice when she's destroyed. You can also use Divine Intervention to then respawn her, potentially generate additional miracle dice. After the fact, we have another Canoness with the Mantle of Ophelia to reduce incoming damage on the bearer to 1. Since these Canonesses also have a once per game ability for a 2+ invulnerable save, they oftentimes can be played independently and kind of be played aggressively as a little bit of utility, kind of obnoxious units that can run up and engage your opponent. They'll generate you miracle dice when they die, but they are also tough enough for your opponent to kill that they often will just have to take a phase off from trying to kill them because of that 2+ invul save. We then have a trio of Hospitalers to regenerate and buff the survivability of their attached units, as well as more of involved. We have a couple of Sororitas Rhinos, 2 Sororitas Rhinos, in fact, alongside 2 units of Arco-Flagellants, 3 Castigators, those equipped with a combination of Castigator autocannons as well as the Battle Cannon, alongside Celestian Sacrosants. The Hospitaller, that will grant you the enhanced resilience that the Hospitaller grants you and the potential that you regenerate those Sacrosants back to the unit. They're -1 to be wounded, they have an invulnerable save, and then also a Feel No Pain, so 1 damage attacks can sometimes just bounce. Then if you don't kill them, they'll start regenerating. Discard Miracle Dice to get D3+1 back, thanks to that Hospitaller. The attached Canoness can also potentially give you some discounts and stratagems like Spirit of the Martyr to allow you to fight on death, or Righteous Vengeance to give you hit rolls and potentially wound rolls on those units as well, to dramatically improve their offensive potential. We then have a Paragon Warsuit squad to attach to Morbid Ball, and that is the entire list. Now, we've been seeing a bit of a trend in these Adepta Sororitas lists, moving away from the more ranged focus lists of the past that were focused on things like Immolators and Dominion squads and Retributor squads and all that stuff, into these very heavy melee squads. We've seen units like the Celestian Sacrosants constantly be reduced in points cost, now down to this relatively affordable 13 points per model. They're backed up by units like Castigators, which are ever-present, pretty solid ranged attackers for the Sororitas stable. But we also have units like Arco-Flagellants that are also very affordable, very high impact melee units. This allows the army to play extremely aggressively, pushing up the table under the cover of shooting, as well as Rhinos to deliver those Sacrosants into the fight and fight over mid-board objectives, using the incredibly annoying stratagems from Hallowed Martyrs, like Divine Intervention to return your units to life, Suffering and Sacrifice to split your opponent's attacks across multiple of your units by forcing them to attack specific targets in order to keep those units going for as long as possible and dominate the center of the battlefield. Very different than a Sororitas list we've seen in the past, which have been entirely focused on peace trading and using extremely squishy units to deal as much damage as possible before dying and generating miracle dice. These lists are trying to drive into you and survive as long as possible, and in order to wrest control of the score of the game from the opposing army. A much more interesting and much more interactive style of build than Sororitas builds we've seen in previous formats.
Now with that, we're going to move to Spain for the Iberian Open GT Granada. This was a 22-player event won by Alvaro Enciso.
Alvaro was playing a Hammer of the Emperor detachment, the vehicle-focused detachment for the faction. This included a trio of Rogel Dorn tank commanders, one of them with Indomitable Steed for a 6+ Feel No Pain, one with Veteran Crew to reroll hit rolls of 1, as well as a Tech Priest Engine Seer. We have 3 Toroxes, as well as some support shooting from a Basilisk and a single Hellhound, alongside 2 units of Krieg Combat Engineers, a Krieg Heavy Weapon Squad with Heavy Flamers, alongside 2 Leman Russ Vanquishers, a Rattling Squad, and a Scout Sentinel. Those Krieg Combat Engineers allow the Toroxes to scout and move aggressively forward and disembark those guys onto forward positions of the battlefield, taking a very aggressive posture to create space between them, the Rogel Dorns, as well as the Leman Russ Vanquishers. You can also embark the heavy weapon squads into the Tauroxes to either deliver them or protect them until they're able to jump out and provide their multiple rounds of shooting in a single turn. The Ratlings can then infiltrate to prevent enemies from infiltrating forward and preventing that scout from happening. The Ratlings also have good synergy with the Tauroxes as well, since they're able to shoot and Scarper to jump into the transport after firing, which allows them to deal some pretty serious damage before jumping back into a vehicle. And all these vehicles can be made significantly faster by the combination of orders, additional advanced movement from the detachment ability, as well as the ability to move through walls thanks to the crash through stratagem. You also have stratagems like a Blade of Plating to allow the Leman Russ or the Rogel Dorns to survive contracted firefights with other heavily armored vehicles, and tactical withdrawal to allow them to fall back and shoot once the battle gets joined after your opponent has fought their way out of the multiple levels of jam that you've given them between the Taurox Primes, combat engineer squads, as well as potentially the Ratlings, locking them into their own deployment zone and preventing them from engaging with your heavy guns while they blast the army apart. Now with that, we'll move over to the Midgard's May GT. This was a 30-player event. This was live streamed over by our friends at Wargames Live, if you are interested. And this one was won by Tau Empire, being piloted by Drew Saltzborn. Drew was playing a Kroot hunting pack. This man loves his mass Kroot builds. This included Commander Shadow Sun to grant an aura of rerolls alongside a single unit of Kroot Carnivores, just 10 Kroot Carnivores, alongside a bunch of gunships, 3 Hammerhead gunships. Those guys are being protected by 18 Krootox Rampagers. They're further supported by a trio of Krootox Rider units, 3 Krootox Riders in each of those, equipped with repeater cannons, as well as more gunships, 3 Skyray gunships, and some stealth battlesuit teams in order to offer them some support. Generally speaking, these kinds of armies want to absorb the center of the table in tons and tons of Krootox. In this detachment, the Krootox can be protected by hidden hunters to give them a lone operative style effect, and have access to guerrilla warriors to make them to allow them to fall back and still charge. They also get enhanced survivability with a 6+ invulnerable save against melee and a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks, in addition to +1 to hit and potentially +1 to wound based on the strength of the target. Given the fact that the list has a ton of ranged attacks from the Tau units in it, you can be bringing enemy units below that starting strength very easily in order to trigger those additional bonuses for the Krootox units later on. So not only are the Krootox protecting the Tau from being engaged traditionally by simply bubble wrapping the Tau gun line that is all going to be centered around the Commander Shadow Sun to give it rerolls, but those gunships in exchange can also damage enemy units and then buff up the Kroot units when targeting them. The synergy works incredibly well, and putting a total of 6 gunship hulls on the table alongside 27 Kroot Cavalry is a lot for any army to chew through. Many armies won't have the capacity to get through this entire list before it shoots them apart, and clearly that worked because Drew did go 5-0 at the event. Now with that, we're going to move over to the large 95-player SSG Miniature Metropolis to talk about the 5-0 players at this event. We did see Space Marines go 5-0 at the event. Johan Nicolaisen going undefeated with Ultramarines, relatively standard Ultramarines build. But what we want to talk about today is Sebastian Larson, who won the event using Chaos Knights. Sebastian was playing a bunch of War Dogs. I don't know if I have much else to say about this one. We see it a lot. It's 6 War Dog Brigands, 6 War Dog Carnivores, and a War Dog Stalker with War of Terror. Pretty standard stuff. War Dogs are good. I don't know. I feel like that kind of goes without saying. It's definitely the case that these lists have been good since the beginning of the edition, and they're not really going anywhere. Dog's a good one, I guess. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. So there's a bunch of War Dogs, and they go through walls sometimes. And also they have a high OC, and they shoot, and they fight good. That's pretty solid, and that's the reason that this is went 5-0. Now with that, we're going to move to the West allotment at War 2 RTT. I don't know why this is called an RTT, because it is a 5-round event, so it does qualify for GT, although it is on the smaller side, only 21 players. Being on the smaller side, though, it was able to play a little faster and looser with the rules, which is why we got to play New Death Guard right at the release. The official street release date is today at the time of recording, Sunday, May 11th, which means that this codex was probably bought at the store as they went to go play it. So that's kind of neat. Eddie Cheater went undefeated with a Death Guard Shamble-Rot Vectorium. Now, for those who don't know, and I will bring up my absolutely cursed screenshots from my Codex leaks here for your viewing pleasure. This is the Poxwalker-focused detachment that gives you a bunch of bonuses for your Poxwalkers. In fact, I like Poxwalkers so much, it just gives you free Poxwalkers. You get 3 units of 10 Poxwalkers over the course of the game on battle rounds 2, 3, and 4 that you can use to go perform actions and complete your utility objectives. You can also buff those Poxwalkers with things like +1 move and +1 attacks and strength from Gnawing Hunger. You can use Shambling Wall to pass damage from your more valuable Death Guard units onto your Poxwalkers. You can also grant Poxwalkers Deep Strike, and allowing them to set up on areas of the battlefield where your opponent maybe wasn't expecting as they come in from Strategic Reserve. That includes both Poxwalkers that placed into Reserve from the start of the game, and also ones that are added to the army over the course of the game, since they're added to your Reserves pool. So you're able to be Deep Striking Poxwalkers from turn 2 onwards, basically anywhere. The detachment also makes Poxwalkers battle line, allowing you to take a ton of them, which is what we did. The army was playing a Lord of Contagion, as well as a Lord of Virulence and Typhus. In terms of Poxwalkers, we are playing a total of 90 in the list, in addition to the 30 that we already get from the detachment ability, granting the army a total of 120 zombie boys shambling across the battlefield. From there, we are using some backline shooting to actually punch holes in enemies that the Poxwalkers can then exploit. We have 2 Chaos Predator Destructors, as well as 2 Chaos Spawn, 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators to attach those Terminator characters into, the Lord of Contagion and the Lord of Virulence. The Lord of Virulence gives them reroll wound rolls on their Plague Spur Gauntlets, whereas the Lord of Contagion gives them lance and sustained hits, allowing them to hit much harder in melee. Those can all be delivered by the Poxwalkers themselves. Since the Poxwalkers do carry Contagions of Nurgle, they're able to afflict enemy units as they run up the table, which then allows the Death Shroud Terminators to teleport near them in order to charge into them with a 6-inch charge out of Deep Strike. We then have some additional application of those auras with a bunch of Fetid Bloat Drones. Bloat Drones in the new Codex gained 2 separate datasheets, a standard Bloat Drone datasheet with Flesh Mowers or Plague Spitters, as well as a datasheet with Heavy Blight Launchers. In this case, we are running 3 Heavy Blight Launcher Bloat Drones, as well as 2 Flesh Mower Bloat Drones. Those give the army a little bit of resilience as well, so you're not easily able to knock out the more heavily armored units like the Predators and the Death Shroud Terminators as soon as they drop onto the table or make themselves known. All of your anti-infantry shooting is likely to be focused on the Poxwalkers because there are so freaking many of them. These guys do infiltrate now, so if you don't have infiltrators yourself, you could be absolutely inundated by a massive number of Poxwalkers just dragging you down with them as they deploy 9 inches outside of your deployment zone and start making charges into your deployment zone on the top of turn 1 to engage your entire army. That could be very problematic for someone wanting to, move out of their deployment zone and score points, I guess. And clearly incredibly effective, as it was able to 5-0 this relatively small GT, but with very good scores. And he dropped no more than 14 points over the course of the weekend. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this video. Pretty cool to talk about Death Guard, but if you want to talk about more lists from these new codexes, stay tuned to my live stream on Monday morning after this goes live. We're going to be breaking down how these armies did and what lists are succeeding in these small tables of Warhammer 40k, those being smaller events like RTTs and local leagues that are allowing these new releases at greater numbers right off the bat. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to Adept Roll for sponsoring this one. And thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.